All right, everybody, welcome to the DC Scrum User Group. My name is Fadi Stefan. I'm going to be your host for tonight. As always, we are here to connect, share, and learn about all things Agile and Scrum. Quick announcements. I want to thank our sponsors, Excella and Kaizenko. Without our sponsors, these events would not be possible. So thanks to our sponsors. And if you are looking for opportunities, Excella is hiring. If you're looking for training, Kaizenko is providing certified Scrum trainings. So you can reach out to me if you want more information. Our last talk from our previous event from Sandeep Pudel is now online, and you can check the recording out on wdcsug.com. Coming up next is going to be Nicole Spence-Goon. That's going to be on July 9th. That's going to be a lunchtime presentation on 3 factors you need to successfully scale in Agile. We also have a special event coming up on July 14th. This is going to be in collaboration with the New York City Lean Kanban User Group. It's going to be an interactive game and system dynamics called the Beer Game. That's going to be hosted by Ihab al-Badri, one of our DC Scrum User Group members. So he's going to be the one running the game. He's going to be hosting this event. That's going to happen July 14th at 6 p.m. As always, we're going to pause for a second and see if anybody has announcements, if anybody is hiring. Please go ahead and mention that. You can add info in the chat if you want to, or you can unmute and introduce yourself if you are hiring. All right, and with that, we are gonna get started with today's presentation. It's gonna be about Beyond Software. I'm glad to have Franky Jones with us today. Franky, let me quickly introduce Franky, and then I'll stop sharing and hand it over to you. So Franky Jones has over 18 years of experience as an educator and a coach, working for ATI Industrial Automation, and he is helping them lead their Agile journey. I'll let Franky tell us more about what he does and about today's talk on Beyond Software. Thanks for being here, Franky. We're looking forward to hearing from you. I'm going to stop sharing and turn it on to you.
All right. Thank you, Fadi. And as I'm getting myself together here, I just wanted to say a big thank you to Fadi and the DC Scrum User Group for just allowing me to be here in the space with you today and to share some of the things that are going on here at ATI. So if you read the abstract at all, we're going to talk about going beyond software, taking the practice of Scrum from software to physical product here at ATI Industrial Automation. As Fadi mentioned, I am the, ahead of myself here. I'm the Information Systems and Software Manager here at ATI. I've been an employee here for about 16 years now. So let me see, make sure 1 second here. Are you guys able to see the presentation okay, Fadi? Okay, thank you. So yeah, I've been here at ATI for around 16 years. I started off in software development, and I've been able to be involved with a lot of the growth initiatives here at ATI and see the company grow. And most recently, I've been involved with the transition to Scrum. So I'm excited to share some of that adventure with you today. So just really quickly, here's what our agenda is going to be for the day. We're going to start off with a quick company overview so I can tell you a little bit about ATI Industrial Automation and what we do. And then we're going to get into the concept of this conversation. I mentioned it in the abstract, and it's a conversation between teammates that really sparked this move into Scrum and got us moving down this path. Now, from there, we'll shift gears a little bit, and we'll talk about Dr. Eliyahu M. Goldratt and his theory of constraints, TOC, and we'll use Dr. Goldratt's theory of constraints and these 4 questions of success kind of as a framework to discuss how we moved into using Scrum for the design of our physical products here at ATI. As with any initiative, there's going to be some victories and there are going to be some challenges. So we'll have some time to talk about that as well. And then we'll leave plenty of space at the end for questions and hopefully some answers to those questions as they pop up for us. So let's go ahead and dive in and let's talk about ATI a little bit. So ATI Industrial Automation has been around for more than 30 years. Our corporate headquarters is here in Apex, North Carolina, is where I'm at right now. But we have multiple sales and support offices throughout the world. We are truly a global organization. We have around 360 employees worldwide, and we're all dedicated to the development of robotic tooling and end effector products. So that might be a mouthful. And when you heard that we are a robotics company, a lot of people immediately jump to, like the Iron Man suit or the iRobot and things like that, but far from it. So let's talk about what a robotic end effector is and take a look at some of our products here. So we have a wide product offering. And a robotic end effector is any object that's attached to the robot at the flange or the wrist, if you think about the wrist of a robotic arm, and it serves a function. So ATI is the leading engineering-based global developer for robotic end effectors and robot arm tooling. So our products are designed to make robots more flexible and more productive. So whereas before we were offering our products, robots had a singular function. With these robotic end effectors that ATI engineers and produces, a robot is able to do multiple tasks, able to get more feedback from its environment, able to do jobs that traditionally were reserved for people. We like to say at ATI, we try to get rid of those jobs that fit the 3Ds, dirty, dull, and dangerous. We want to get people out of those spaces and really put robots into those spaces as well. So we have a very modular product design. So there are tons of different combinations that our customers can get. So we have a very wide product offering. This means we're kind of a high mix, low volume space in terms of manufacturing and in terms of our product engineering. And speaking of engineering, our bread and butter is custom engineering. We are dedicated to solving complex problems with our customers to try to help them find solutions for their manufacturing and robotic needs. There's no better thing for us than to get a call from a customer to say, ATI, we need you to help us solve this problem. And we're immediately off to the races to try to help them out with that. Speaking of those customers, we work with quite a few that you may be familiar with. NASA, SpaceX, Amazon, BMW. We get a chance to work with some awesome companies with some truly groundbreaking applications. And it makes it really exciting to be involved in those customer successes. In this next slide, we have just a quick video of some of our products in action. What we're seeing here is one of our force torque sensors being used to give force feedback so we can know how much force a robot is applying in its particular application. And here it's a heavy industrial application using one of our large sensors. One of our proudest moments came last year when we partnered with NASA to have components on the latest Mars rover. So we were able to create a force torque sensor to be involved in the sample caching apparatus for the Mars rover so that it knows how much force it's exerting, how it can safely store those samples for later retrieval. This was really a feather in the cap of ATI's engineering teams. Robotic surgery is another large area where you'll see our products in use. It's definitely a growth market where the precision of robots is just exponentially better than freehand movement. And lastly, what you may expect to see more frequently is, heavy assembly with robots doing manufacturing, where our tool changers and other products allow robots to be more flexible in what they're doing in a factory setting. Whereas before you would have a single factory that makes one vehicle or one thing. Now you can have a single factory do 5 different things based on the set of tooling that the robot can pick up and use with our tool changers. So we have a wide array of applications for our products. So it gives us a lot of different things to focus on here. But we're here to talk about Scrum. So let's go ahead and talk about how we began that journey. So let's talk about a conversation for change. And I would imagine that many of you on the call have been involved with the implementation of Scrum at an organization from the ground up. either as an employee of that organization or possibly even as an educator or a consultant. And as try as we might to put a sugar coating on it, there's one thing that's pretty consistent across the board. Scrum is a change. Many times it's not just a process change, it's a cultural change for an organization. And anytime there's going to be a change in an organization, there's going to be a little bit of pain. And I like to lead off with this quote here. We must all suffer from one of two pains, the pain of discipline or the pain of regret. The difference is discipline weighs ounces while regret weighs tons. That's from Jim Rohn. And to be quite honest, pain was the starting point of the conversation that led to our Scrum transition at ATI. So it started with a conversation about our reality in the software space. At the time, I was the supervisor of the software development team here at ATI. And one of my teammates, Bryce Leonard, came into my office, and he was looking like he had a heavy weight on his shoulder, downtrodden. And we have a very open relationship and open team atmosphere. So we talked about our current reality on the software dev team. And what we talked about were things that may sound familiar to a lot of you. We had this monolithic list of things that we needed to do, but no real method for managing them effectively. So we ended up coming in and dealing with our work based off of who was yelling the loudest, what dumpster was on fire that day, shifting priorities leading to uncertainty in what we needed to do. What we ended up with was technical debt that just piled up and we didn't get a chance to pay it down. It was to the point where we didn't really know what we were going to walk into on a daily basis or what we were going to be able to work on that day. We were really, flying by the seat of our pants when it came to the work that we were trying to get done. And as the leader of the team, a lot of these things rested squarely on me, and it was time for a change. So what I really realized in this conversation is that what Bryce was telling me in all these things is that he wasn't happy. And what I realized in this conversation, I wasn't happy either with the way things were going. And Bryce suggested, why don't we explore some agile practices? Now, I would love to sit here and tell you that, we decided to embark on this Scrum journey out of, a sense of higher purpose for the organization, that we wanted to conquer this to make ATI this great juggernaut in the industry. But the truth is, it was a very selfish motivation that got us started on this Scrum journey. And I'm about to use the H word right here, so be careful. We just wanted to be happier at work. And that was the real motivation for us. So we wanted to explore and see where we could go. So we started the journey. This was around the top of 2018 and we had no formal training, but we were determined. We wanted to get started. So we began our education by reading Sutherland's book, doing the art of doing twice the work in half the time. And it turns out the timing of our journey was advantageous because we quickly realized that after we read this book is that Scrum dovetailed very nicely with two other major initiatives that were already in flight here at ATI. And those initiatives were employee engagement, for which we partnered with Gallup, and Lean, our Lean initiative, continuous improvement, the elimination of waste. And through our learnings, we saw that Scrum fit in just right with all of these. So we came up with this graphic, and some of my teammates teased me because it's like, oh, that's a great fidget spinner graphic that you described there, Franky. But, I'll take it. It gets the point across. Scrum kind of completes the puzzle here and joins those things and provides a pathway for us. So we were on the journey, and we already had a small team here on the software development team. And just as we were getting started, some members got another opportunity elsewhere. So we lost 1/3 of our developer resources right as we were getting started with the Scrum transition. And with this loss, Bryce and I sat back down and had another discussion. And, we were kind of trying to decide, should we continue or should we wait until we get somebody else in? And thankfully, we decided to double down on our commitment to implement Scrum for our team. So we were off to the races. So we started experimenting, just like you should when you're doing Scrum. We made a lot of mistakes along the way, and we learned from those mistakes. We documented processes. And we started to gain momentum. So by the time we began the process to fill the vacancies that were on our team, we already had a well-established process and rhythm that made it easy to onboard new people. And even before we onboarded new people, we were able to get back to the level of productivity very close to what we had before we even lost those developers. So it was a great gain for us. So we really hung our hats on the Scrum values. We used the FORCE acronym: focus, openness, respect, commitment. And for the E, we say extreme courage. We really hang our hats on those because we wanted to focus on our people first. Remember, we had a very selfish intent here. We wanted to be happy at work. So we wanted to make sure in doing this, we focused on our people first. And thankfully, we already had a great team chemistry, and that was instrumental in our success. So like I said, we had plenty of successes and we had some failures along the way and some mistakes, but those became learning opportunities. And we quickly saw that other parts of the organization were taking note. We started getting some questions, people asking about Scrum. And then before we knew it, there were other Scrum teams popping up in other sections of the organization. And mostly it was for special projects or special interest initiatives that we had going. And Scrum was growing, and it was great to see. We also realized that there needed to be some guidance there. So to help guide the growth of Scrum within our organization, we created what we call the Scrum Think Tank. This is essentially where we brought together all of the leaders of the Scrum teams that had popped up to share ideas, talk about what's working well, what's not working well. Try this the next time you do a retrospective, try this way of estimation. You can kind of think of it as a collective retrospective with all the Scrum users on a monthly basis. And ultimately, this group collaborated to create the ATI Scrum guidelines. So the idea with these guidelines was not to be some sort of restrictive or prescriptive document, but rather to just serve as a means to facilitate learning and self-organization. If the company was indeed on this road leading us down to Scrum or leading us on this Scrum journey, we wanted these guidelines to serve as the guardrails. So people had a clear understanding of they can find wherever they need to be within these guardrails for what Scrum practice fits their teams. So we saw lots of success, lots of growth, lots of information sharing, and Scrum continued to gain momentum at ATI. And then it came. So we were seeing successes and challenges with those Scrum teams that were in place. And then in around the second quarter of 2020, leadership made the decision that all of engineering should start using Scrum by the end of Q3, around October. And this is where you cue the dramatic sounds, the dun, 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 or if you're a fan of Law and Order, like my wife is, it would be that dramatic Law and Order sound, that clunk, clunk, when they switch scenes to some dramatic new landscape here. So you might be thinking, second quarter of 2020, isn't that when COVID-19, the pandemic had us in a tussle and it shut everything down? Isn't that when everybody was thrust into this new mode of remote work? Isn't it when we were already struggling to find out what the new normal is? And you would be right. That is exactly the timing of when this mandate came. Go forth and do Scrum. So with its timing, you would think that it was more not go forth and do Scrum, but go forth and drown. That's why I have this ocean background for this graphic here. Turns out it couldn't be further from the truth. It was actually a great decision from leadership to go ahead and push for this. It was actually the perfect time to tackle this pain of change. Like we referred back to in our opening quote, there's going to be some pain. Why not proactively be disciplined and deal with it? So things were already getting turned upside down because of the pandemic, and changes were going to be happening. So why not go ahead and make this change to Scrum for our product engineering? We were already seeing tremendous value with those special project Scrum teams that I mentioned earlier. And we noticed that there was an impediment that was also an incentive for us to make the push. A lot of those team members who were participating on those special project Scrum teams had a little bit of an issue. Part of their work was on that Scrum team was being proctored by Scrum, but the other part, their full capacity wasn't dedicated to that. The other part of their capacity was being proctored by some waterfall type of method, and it turned out to be a detractor to productivity. So why not go ahead and have everything be proctored by Scrum across the board? Also, too, another advantageous aspect of this and the timing is that we saw teams with well-established Scrum practices didn't miss a beat when the pandemic hit. That force to go to remote work and not being co-located and in the same space. Those teams that already had those Scrum tools in place and had the rhythm going were able to keep delivering value and be productive without missing a beat. So with all those things considered, yes, we had this pandemic and everything going on, but it was time to tackle this pain of discipline and implement Scrum for the design of our physical products across the board. So it was time to go forth. And this is a good segue for us to talk about how we went forth with this endeavor. And this is where we're going to start talking about Dr. Eliyahu M. Goldratt and his theory of constraints, and how we're going to use that to frame up the rest of our discussion about how we did this for physical product. So Dr. Goldratt was a physicist originally, and then he transitioned into examining human-based systems. But what he wanted to make sure that he did is he wanted to take that same scientific approach, that same logic that he used as a physicist in solving problems as a physicist, and apply those into the human-based systems. So what he decided to do was focus on manufacturing. So in 1984, he introduced his theory of constraints with his book called The Goal. Some of you may be familiar with this. I came across this when I was involved with the Lean Steering Committee here at ATI as we were getting started on our Lean journey. The Goal is a novel. It's written as a novel that introduces the theory of constraints as a fictitious plant manager struggles and strives to save his plant from being closed down. If you're unfamiliar with The Goal, you still may be familiar with the theory of constraints, because the Phoenix Project was actually based on The Goal. So that's another novel that utilizes the theory of constraints, but frames it around IT and DevOps. So I mentioned the theory of constraints a couple of times. So let's just talk about what Goldratt was trying to say here with his theory of constraints. So his theory of constraints, TOC, states that every process that we have in our business consists of a set of interrelated activities. And among those interrelated activities, there's always going to lie at least one weak link or limiting factor. And that one weak link or limiting factor is going to hinder the output of the whole process. So businesses who want to improve their business processes need to focus on finding these constraints, these weak links, these bottlenecks, and focus their attention on managing, improving, or optimizing those particular bottlenecks. That's what the theory of constraints tells us. It seems to be like straightforward common sense, but when you actually start looking, it's kind of hard when you get started to filter down to the actual root cause, to find that bottleneck and not just symptoms of it. So later in his career, Goldratt published another work called Beyond the Goal, and he continued his discussion of his theory of constraints, and he specifically framed it to reference technology. And at the core of this work, Beyond the Goal, is one fundamental statement, and he uses 4 questions to really explore the validity of this statement. And here's the statement. A technology can be a benefit if and only if it removes a limitation. In this fundamental statement here, you could replace technology with process, framework, change, system, whatever the case may be. It can provide benefit if and only if it removes a limitation. So that's a profound statement. So to help us evaluate it, Dr. Goldratt presented 4 questions for success that we really want to evaluate whenever we're looking at a framework or a change or something along those lines. So first question, what is the power of the technology? What is the power of the framework? What is the power of the process? Usually this is the easiest question for us to answer. And unfortunately, it's also where we tend to spend the majority of our time, is figuring out what are all the bells and whistles of this new thing. But it still is very important that we understand the power of the technology or of the framework. The second question that we want to address, what limitation does the technology or the framework diminish? We have to make sure we answer this question very clearly, and it's going to be different for every organization, for every project, for everything that you're evaluating. What limitation does it diminish? We have to make sure we answer this, because otherwise we're potentially making changes that don't solve any of our problems, and that doesn't bring us value. So that's an important question to answer. And most of the time we can do really well answering questions 1 and 2, but we start to go off the rails a little bit when we get to questions 3 and 4. Question number 3, what rules are currently in place to accommodate the limitation? So the limitation existed before we came across this new technology, this new framework, this new process. What are the rules that are currently in place that we use to avoid, mitigate, eliminate, or accommodate this limitation that we just identified? How did we deal with it? It's important to answer that question so that we can use it in the answering of question number 4. Now that we have this new technology, this new framework that uses the limitation, what rules should we use now? It's important to have that answer, because if we keep doing those same things that we were doing in our answer to question number 3, we're not going to see the benefit or the value of the change of the framework that we're trying to implement. So these 4 questions are very powerful whenever you're trying to evaluate, should we do this project? How should we do this project? Should we implement this new process? Should we implement this change? It's a very versatile and lightweight framework that serves as a great guide for conversations and discussion. So we're going to use these 4 questions to evaluate the implementation of Scrum for the design of physical products at ATI. The only downside is I really wish I would have had access to this before we began our journey. We came across Dr. Goldratt's Beyond the Goal after we had already begun our journey, but hindsight is 2020, so we can use this as a lens for iterating our way forward as we continue to try to improve. So let's dive in. Question number 1, what is the power of Scrum for managing products or managing projects, specifically for the design of physical products? This is a Scrum user group meeting, so I don't have to go into tons of detail here. If you find that you do need more information, as Fadi mentioned, we have some great sponsors and we have some great practitioners that are on the call that you can reach out to if you need some Scrum training or additional information about how to leverage Scrum in your organization. But let's talk about some of the heavy hitters that we typically hear when we talk about the power of Scrum. Establishing a rhythm of value delivery with your sprint cadence, built-in continuous improvement, frequent feedback cycles so that we can pivot, make decisions, and make sure that we're working on the right things at the right time. The notion of outcomes over outputs. And then one of my favorites, empowerment, giving teams and employees the sense of empowerment so that they can decide how problems are solved. Those are some of those powerful core elements of Scrums that we typically hear about. So now that we're well aware of the power of Scrum. So now let's shift to question 2. What limitation does Scrum diminish or eliminate in the engineering of products? So once again, I'm going to lean on the power of the Scrum user group, and I'm going to describe the way that things were done prior to the transition. And I want to see if any of you can identify what the limitation is, and we'll go from there. All right. So in our engineering space, it was very much a waterfall-esque approach that had strict phase gates for each one of our work items. We had teams of engineers working together, kind of divvied up based on the products that they work on. Each team had a supervisor and a collection of 5 to 6, sometimes even more design engineers on the team. And then we also had resource teams of engineers that offer support, whether it be software design verification, marketing materials, whatever the case may be, to support the development of these new products. So as you can see, I've only got a couple of lines up here. These lines represent information, tasks, whatever the case may be, deliverables that have to flow between these teams. And just drawing a couple of lines up here, it already looks like some geometric monstrosity. Imagine if we had a line going from each one of those engineers to the resource team. And imagine then, even beyond that, if those engineers had multiple projects in flight at one time, the complex communication and the level of complication, it just grows exponentially. And this doesn't even account for touch points outside of the engineering department. In this space, the unit of work is a project, and each project has a single engineer assigned as the project leader. And that engineer is responsible for making sure that project gets completed and results in a product that can ship out the door to the customer. At any given time, there could be 200 projects in process at one time within the engineering department. And of course, all of them were important. So that led to long lead times and things of that nature. So based on that brief description, what do you think the limitation might be that we would try to eliminate? Anybody want to take a guess?
One, from what I understood, is bus number, like a very low bus number. You have one person responsible for a project, if I understood correctly. So you have a big possibility of failure there.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, if you say knowledge silos, that low bus number, you're absolutely right. Complex communication, hey, you're right there too. Conflicting priorities, right yet again.
I was going to mention that. Yeah, priorities, no prioritization.
Right.
And
what we really got. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no prioritization means nothing gets done, pretty much.
Right. If everything is important, nothing is important, right? That's how that old saying goes. But all of those things are really symptoms of the core problem that we identified, which there's too much work in progress. That is the core limitation that we really hope to diminish with Scrum. These other things that we identified are symptoms of too much work being in flight at one time. So let's move on. We've identified what our limitation is. What rules or processes are currently in place to address the limitation? So with all this WIP, all this work in process, there's shifting priorities or there were a lack of priority. So the reflex was to lean into the phase gate control mechanism that we had in place in our design control system, as well as to lean on a heavy approval process. So a heavy approval process was the thing that we did to address the limitation. And it worked this way. There are 4 phase transitions in our design control space, and each one of those phase transitions required a set of approvals before work could continue. This is a time-consuming approval process. It could involve lots of people inside and outside of the engineering department, and it really slowed things down. The way that the approval process was able to address the limitation of too much work in progress is it offered a shield, so to speak, a CYA measure to be able to deal with priority shifts. So if you were able to say, all right, I've got all of these approvals to say I'm supposed to be working on this, if a project leader were to get approached with those why questions, why are you working on this project? Why are you not working on this one? Where are we on this one? They would have the approval process as a shield to say, here is what was approved for me to work on, and this is why I'm working on these particular things. So that was what was in place to address the limitation. So now shifting to question 4, what rules or processes should we use now? This is still a work in process for us. We're learning as we go. One of the things that we identified is that, well, we have to get rid of the heavy approval process for our projects, and our engineers have already figured out a way to do that. So those approval processes have been removed from the system. Move away from those heavy phase gates that I talked about. That's still in process. We haven't gotten rid of them completely, but we are well on our way to not being as dependent on them as we once were. Eliminate the concept of a singular project leader. You know, as it was mentioned, that notion of having a singular project leader working on a project results in those knowledge silos, and that notion of having a very low bus number. Also, too, that contributes to the large number of work in process, large amount of work in process. If you have an entire team and everybody has their own collection of projects, when you come together for a Scrum planning meeting, or a sprint planning meeting or a sprint review, everybody's like, here are my projects. Here's what I'm going to work on. I'm going to go work on these for the sprint, and I'll come back and I'll tell you what I did when we're done. So eliminating that concept of a singular project leader is also going to be one of the new rules in place. And then just better prioritization. So we do the right things first. And this is not something that's solely on the engineering teams. This is something for me and my peers on the leadership team to make sure that we're communicating the goals of the organization effectively so that they can use that as the lens to better understand these are the important things that need to be worked on. Let us reduce this amount of WIP. So we have the answers to our questions. We have this great statement, Scrum is rolling and we're ready for success. Everything's going to work perfectly now, right? Wrong. As we all know, Scrum's not like the Matrix. It's not the red pill or the blue pill. There's not a magic bullet that's going to make everything work properly. I think we've all heard the saying at some point or another that, Scrum does not solve all of the problems of your organization. But if you do it right, Scrum will expose all of the problems of your organization so that you can address them. And that is very much the case. As we've moved forward with this, we've had some great victories. We've also run into some additional challenges. So we can talk about those here in these next couple of slides. So victory, some of the big victories that we've seen, and this is not the sum of all our victories that we have here, but these are the ones I wanted to mention in our talk tonight. We've really embraced, since moving to Scrum, we've really embraced the PDCA cycle, plan, do, check, act. We've really got into this rhythmic delivery of value. All right, we're going to work for this amount of time. We're going to deliver these elements of value. We're going to get feedback. We're going to adjust our plan. Our engineers have done a great job of establishing a very reliable cadence to their work. And that's led to, improved communication, better visibility of things. It's been a very great benefit for us. And as I touched on, greatly improved communication. All of our Scrum events, communication with stakeholders, having to have discussion with product owners, between the product owners and the dev teams and product managers. We have a lot more communication happening, and we can even still get better with that. Probably my favorite one on this list is that fourth bullet, empowerment and self-organization. I mentioned that at the very beginning. Remember, this all started with a very selfish endeavor from the software team. We wanted to be happier at work. We wanted to be empowered in the things that we were doing. So empowerment and self-organization has been a big benefit for engineering as well, specifically self-organization. So when that mandate came to go forth in Scrum, our engineers self-organized. They organized a Scrum implementation team where they pulled people from across all of the functional groups within the engineering space that would end up being on separate Scrum teams, but they wanted to get all the input from across the entire department to prepare for this transition and really set the table of how this was going to be rolled out. And once they finally did go live with implementing Scrum in engineering, they continued the self-organization. A couple of more entities were created. There was a product owner roundtable created where the product owners from the respective Scrum teams get together on a regular basis to talk about, all right, here are the things that our teams are working on. Here's the value that we're trying to deliver. Are we competing for the same resources? How are you guys doing this? How are you dealing with these problems? In the same fashion, a Scrum Master roundtable was formed to facilitate the discussion of this between the Scrum Masters across the organization. And then lastly, there was an executive action team formed, and the executive action team is from our executive leadership group in the organization. And our objective on the EAT is to provide clarity when it comes to the why. Why are we doing Scrum? Also, to help remove any impediments that the Scrum Masters can't remove themselves or as a collection at the roundtable to really just facilitate the process. And lastly, one of the big victories is encouragement of experimentation. We're a robotics company, we're a technology company, and we hang our hat on innovation. And you cannot have innovation without experimentation. And sometimes experimentation results in that dreaded F word that nobody likes to say, which is failure. But failures are learning opportunities. We've encouraged experimentation by having relatively quick turnaround sprints. Most of the teams are using 2-week sprints. So that sprint, that time box designated for that sprint, is an experiment in and of itself, an opportunity to test a hypothesis, to test if a path is going to work, to get feedback from a customer on something that we're going to design. So that's been a tremendous victory as well. And now for the challenges. So there are plenty more challenges that I have listed here, but for the sake of our discussion, I thought these 3 were great ones to talk about. Doubt and inertia. So some of you, I'm pretty sure most of you have heard this conversation before. Scrum only works for software. You can't use Scrum for anything else. How can we use this for physical product? What's our product increment going to be at the end of each sprint? We can't have a shippable physical product each sprint. We have to do prototyping and order components and things of that nature. So before we got started with Scrum, there was a lot of challenge around doubt about how we could make Scrum work for physical product and to be able to navigate around some of those things people thought would be impediments. In terms of inertia, like I mentioned, ATI has been around for over 30 years and has been a successful company for that 30 years, doing that same thing and the way we design products for 30 years. So when you have a track record of proven success for 30 years, there's going to be some inertia when you're trying to change the way that people are working, the way that people are thinking, and change the culture of an organization. We started to see some pressure from the organization chart. And what we mean from that is how the teams are formed. It's not uncommon once a Scrum transition happens that the formation of the Scrum teams no longer kind of matches up well with how the org chart has been designed. So our Scrum teams were formed from those product teams that I outlined before. And in many cases, supervisors became product owners and Scrum masters were volunteered or they were voluntold to serve in that capacity. So we're working in a new way, but the org chart is still the same. We're working as a team, as a Scrum team, and there's supposed to be this dialogue between the dev team and the product owner, but the product owner is also the manager or the supervisor. So that may quell some of that feeling of empowerment that you would want your team to have. And we're still navigating this and trying to figure out the best way forward. And also too, with this notion of focusing on organizational outcomes versus individual output, we also need to make some adjustments in our performance evaluation processes because you're going to get what you measure. So we need to make sure our performance evaluation processes line up with the principles and values that we're hoping to see from our Scrum teams. And then this last challenge I'll talk about, better versus perfection. At ATI, we have some of the best engineers in the world, and their goal is to seek perfection in their designs, in the solutions that they create for our customers. And as we all know, there is no perfecting Scrum. If somebody's telling you they're doing Scrum perfectly, they're lying to you. Don't believe them, because continuous improvement is always part of the game with Scrum. We can always do it better. So what we're running into, and we're wanting to make sure we don't run headlong into, is this notion of sacrificing better in the pursuit of perfection. We want to make sure we're able to get these incremental improvements to get better versus paralysis by analysis as we're seeking this perfect state of nirvana here in Scrum. The way this is manifesting itself right now is the search for the perfect tool for managing our backlogs and things of that nature. What's the perfect tool that we need there? So we want to make sure we stay focused on getting better every day rather than trying to be perfect all at once. So those are some of the things that we're running into. What's the future look like for Scrum at ATI? Let me gaze into my crystal ball app here. Well, obviously, when we want to continue to push the envelope with our Scrum processes and iterate our way forward and continuously improve to make sure that we're doing the very best that we can. Again, we want to get better every day, taking those small incremental steps. We also want to extend Scrum to other areas of our organization. Our continuous improvement team, marketing, some of our quality teams, some of our manufacturing engineering spaces have already transitioned to Scrum as well and are seeing success, and we want to continue that evolution. One of the areas that is on the list as a target is our manufacturing and assembly. So we're already using Scrum now for the design of our product. Now we want to use Scrum for actually building our products on a daily basis for order fulfillments. And that's not that big of a jump. Those teams already have daily huddles. They're utilizing visual management, and their work comes to the shop floor in a date prioritized backlog already. So with just a few tweaks here and there, we could be up and running with Scrum in our manufacturing and assembly spaces as well. But most importantly, the future for Scrum at ATI, going back to my selfish initiative back in the beginning, we want to focus on our people first. I'm going to use that H word again. We want to continue to strive toward making ATI a place where a team member can come and be the best version of themselves, and where they can be happy and proud of what they do and feel like they are empowered to make a difference, not only at ATI, but in the world at large that we serve. So that's what I'm hoping our future looks like. We've still got a long way to go to get there, but I think since we've implemented Scrum and it's growing, the path there has gotten much clearer. So in closing, remember these 4 questions for success, whether it's implementing a new framework like Scrum, implementing a big project. Take these 4 questions into account and answer them before you get started, so you don't have to use them in hindsight like we're using right now. They've been impactful for us. The teachings of Dr. Goldratt have been helpful in our lean endeavors as well as in the Scrum space. And I'm hoping to see continued success from the Scrum teams here at ATI. And that's it for me. I really appreciate, again, the opportunity to be here sharing with you today. And with that, Fadi, I'll turn it back over to you.
Awesome. Fantastic. Thanks, Franky, for sharing your experience and your journey. Fantastic. So we're going to open up for questions. So we'll spend a few minutes taking questions. If you have a question for Franky, please unmute and go ahead and ask your question.
Franky, hi. This is Sanjay. I am a Scrum practitioner for a while. I've been doing it. A quick question I had is, you mentioned the word outcome rather than output. That's an interesting phase, but how did you accomplish that? To me, it's like when we do software, people are developing things which nobody's going to ever use because that's what they find interesting or they're not going to use right now. How do you prevent those kind of work?
So that goes into that communication, that whole concept. And again, this is still very much a work in progress, Sanjay. Focusing on clear communication of organizational objectives. So when teams and specifically product owners and product managers are determining what brings the most value, they have a very clear and concise lens through which to view the body of work so that we can work on the right things first and deliver the best value first. So those outcomes versus, those pet projects like, oh yeah, I'm very interested in this new super laser beam technology thing over here, but that doesn't solve any problems for our organization. So, getting to that notion of outcomes versus outputs involves a lot of things, that clear communication of organizational objectives, and then a use of those objectives as a value lens evaluator for our product owners.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay.
Franky, I joined late, so forgive me if I missed this part. So you work mostly in a hardware space, from what I understood. What technologies or methodologies have you investigated in trying to shorten your lead time from a hardware perspective? So I come from an electronics background. I used to work in microprocessors. So for us, it was, using technologies like, FPGAs and programmable chips and stuff like that, so that we can actually test out a circuit before we actually fabricate it.
Right.
And today we have 3D printers and all that kind of stuff. So can you enlighten us maybe in some of the things you've been thinking about there? Because I have absolutely no idea what people do there.
Sure. So, and just for clarification, my main focus is in information systems. So I do live in a software space. But in terms of our hardware Scrum teams, our physical product Scrum teams, we have quite an array of on-site prototyping. We have a machine shop on site that helps with our rapid prototyping. We've also, like you mentioned, utilized 3D printing to give us quick views of how things are going to fit together. Is this spatially going to work? Is this whole depth going to work? Is this going to give enough material to bear the load that we're expecting it to use? And we also use a lot of simulation software. Some of our design verification teams are using some of our CAD extensions of our CAD modeling package to do actual simulations to make sure that things are getting done properly or that things are going to work properly before we even get a physical prototype in hand or try to take them to production. And that's on top of our existing quality controls that come through our design verification lab that we have on site. That's what I like to call the playground. That's where the engineers get to go and try to find the most creative way possible to break a prototype or find the failure mode and examine manufacturability and things like that. So those are the things that we're using.
Cool, thank you.
Yes, sir.
And sorry, follow-up question. Like, does the software team and hardware team, like, do they collaborate together, or is it just like each one's doing their own thing?
No, so in the engineering space, if you remember that graphic I put up that showed the product teams and then a couple of resource teams, one of those resource teams that serves all of the products is our engineering software group. And they're responsible for designing the embedded systems that might run on some of the chipsets and things. So yeah, there is a high level of collaboration between, the board designers and the software people and the people who are designing the modules and tool changers and other products that are actually going to ship out the door.
Sorry, another follow-up question, unless someone wants to jump in. Have you ever put together a team where you have like the software and hardware people working on the product together as a Scrum team?
Yes, so that was one of the first iterations outside of our software team when Scrum first started. We have a special project to rapidly improve one of our products, and it was composed of a truly cross-functional team where we had mechanical, electronics, and software engineers all collaborating on the same Scrum team. It yielded some really good benefits for us. But as I alluded to during the talk, the thing that we ran into, that was one project that they were working on that was being managed by Scrum. The remainder of their capacity was being controlled by this waterfall type of project process. So we inevitably ran into some conflicting priorities and trouble making sure capacity was allocated properly in that way.
Certainly an interesting experiment to run.
Hi, Franky. This is Ankit. I want to know when you have separate hardware teams and software teams, but they're working on the same product, how do they communicate with each other? I mean, apart from, of course, your PI planning, there are a lot of dependencies that are there between the hardware and software. How do they usually communicate, and how are the dependencies communicated between these teams? And I'll give you an example. As a matter of fact, I have worked for a company where on the hardware side, both hardware and software teams were doing Scrum. Mm-hmm. And then a hardware team decided that the new requirement was that their flash RAM that they were using was supposed to function even at minus 74 degrees Fahrenheit. And so they had to move to a different company. But the write speeds were very slow as compared. So on the software side, the impact was the reprogramming that which usually took 17 minutes, it became 1 hour and 15 minutes. And that was a huge impact on the software side. And so these kind of things and this was mission critical. And we were doing this over the air. So in such scenarios where you have a product, both hardware and software, and the hardware changes can drastically impact the software. So we have to come up with innovative ways of reducing that time. But in your case, how are these teams communicating when the impacts could be so huge?
Absolutely. So Scrum is a great framework. And there are lots of great systems out there, but there is no system that is a substitute for a face-to-face conversation between interested parties. And that's what we really encourage when with a change with that type of scope pops up. In terms of a systematic approach to handling that communication, those types of things are typically communicated in that product owner roundtable entity that I mentioned that the engineers self-organized into, where the product owners from the respective Scrum teams get together and talk about what's going on. And also too, at the individual project level, there's a high level of communication for task dependencies. There's a lot of room for us to grow there to better see dependencies and to reduce dependencies, but we're able to navigate it with those mechanisms right now. That face-to-face conversation being one of the most powerful though.
Right. But is your company all local in one location? Would that even be possible if they're geographically distributed?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm in North Carolina right now. So
yes,
I mean,
and your company is all over the world, for example?
Yeah, we're global. I mean, all of our research and development happens here. All of our engineering happens here at our Apex facility, at our corporate headquarters. But people involved in decision-making processes could be, other places of the country or the world. So we use whatever tools are available to us to facilitate that discussion.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Yes, sir.
So one thought comes to my mind with Ankit's question. What it seems to me the challenge you were posing is that people were not refining or grooming the product backlog well, because it's like take a software engineer going and changing a piece of code without talking to anybody. How is that possible in a proper Scrum function? You do not make changes without, as a team, refining the requirements and the user story, shall we say? So without that, I don't know. People can do whatever they feel like that.
Yeah, there definitely has to be some proctoring of the backlog.
Yeah,
right. In our case, of course, it was communicated to us. I'm just giving an example that when we tested the new software, we very quickly found out that the write speeds really impact the way the software is functioning. So we had to re-architect the software.
Right,
communicate
correct.
It's just that I was curious. Yeah.
Yeah, in a true Scrum, that would not happen. You would discuss the ramification, even maybe do an experiment before approving it. Then you are not a team.
That is true. Now, in many companies, global companies, what happens is that, and that has been my practical experience in several different companies, is that many a times the hardware and software divisions or departments are totally different. And many a times that cross-department communication lags behind. That's when these things happen, because as soon as this new hardware was provided to us, even before it left the company, of course, I mean, a long ways before it left the company, the software engineers figured it out very quickly. Oh, hey, everything is working so slow, starting from reprogramming to even the screens that are showing up, and this is an embedded device. So what do we do? And then we connected with the hardware devices and or department, and we came to know that they changed the flash RAM. And that was on the day one we were given the hardware device to test. But then, yes, that communication gap was there, and that across departments.
Okay.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing, Annie. Any other questions for Franky?
So Franky, I'm curious about the product increment you talked about. So is it? Can you explain what did you deliver or what are you delivering every two weeks at the end of the sprint?
It varies from product group to product group and from project to project at this time. Sometimes that product increment might be the fully fleshed out specification document that you need to get customer approval on. Mm-hmm. Other times it could be a full-fledged completed 3D model of what the what the product is going to be. Other times it could be a functional prototype. So it all depends on where those projects are as they're matriculating through their different stages to completion. So obviously it's not a shippable product, right, as we would like to see, you know, in a traditional Scrum setup, like maybe with software, but it is still a defined, and the way the engineering team describes it, they call it sprint goals. So we have our sprint goal to provide this thing, and they select what their product increments are going to be, and they've been doing a great job with that.
Anyway, the reason I was mentioning my wife is an architect. I'm trying to get her to move to Scrum.
Okay.
She said, so as you can imagine, she has a similar problem. You cannot develop one pillar at a time, you know, of a building. So yeah, so I was just curious.
Sure. I mean, you know, it's the same sort of concept though, right? Where we want to think about, all right, we want to deliver this finished product. How can we incrementally get there?
Right. Yeah.
And have each one of those increments be something of value. It may not be the finished product, but it's still something of value to the organization or to the endeavor.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was good. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
So I'd like to first thank you for an excellent presentation. And I love that line that you mentioned on one of the slides where you said that Scrum does not really solve the problems, but exposes the problems of your organization. And I'm paraphrasing there, of course, but I was just curious as to what problems did you expose as an organization?
So, you know, we touched on a couple of those things when we got into the challenges aspect, when we talked about some of those challenges on that one slide, you know, where there was that inertia and there was that doubt that people received that mandate, you're moving to Scrum. So folks started doing Scrum, but as we got to going in that, some of those feelings started to come to the surface, and we got to see those and address those. It also brought to the light an issue with prioritization. You know, knowing that we've got so many things in flight, you know, we've got to do a better job of trying to identify where that real value lies in order for us to achieve our organizational objectives. Those were the big things that came up in the engineering space. You know, in the software space, from when we first got started, when it was just my software team that was doing Scrum, one of the biggest problems was that, you know, we weren't addressing technical debt. That was one of the things that was evident right away. We were accruing technical debt, but we weren't able to pay it down. And that was, you know, really made evident when we started sprinting forward so we could, you know, start to resolve it. And one of the things, and I'll say this, one of the things that we did, and it's one of the mistakes that we made. It'll be two mistakes that we made in the software side when we first started, and when the engineers started, I made sure to share this with them. Is that one, we erroneously associated effort estimations with time. You know, the notion of effort where it should be complexity, we conflated complexity and time, and we were able to manage with it, but things could have been a lot better if we would have handled that correctly. The second thing that we didn't do right out of the gate was to have a legitimate sprint retrospective. You know, we were doing a review, we were doing planning, but we weren't having that retrospective for the team. And it's that retrospective that really unearths those things, where we can see where those problems are that are being surfaced by Scrum, so we can come up with those action items to address them. So once we started having a regimented sprint retrospective, that's when we were really off to the races making improvements.
All right, we have time for one last question.
If nobody goes, then can I go? I know I talk too much.
Just give people 1 second, Sanjay, and you can.
Okay, now I will. That's fair enough.
All right, go ahead. Last question.
Okay, so this is one of the things I'm trying to achieve and trying to almost perfect. How do you implement continual improvement? Or how did you do it, or how are you trying to do it? What is your way of doing it?
So, continuous improvement in ATI preceded Scrum. Like I mentioned in our presentation, in our talk, continuous improvement was one of our major initiatives before we even thought about doing Scrum, and it started in our operations area, in manufacturing. So the whole notion of lean. Some people use Six Sigma, the elimination of waste, trying to get better every day, trying to empower employees to find ways to make things better, because the people who know the most about a process and an area are the people who are working in that space and doing the work every day, and really empowering them to have a voice, to speak up, and have a say in how things are done in their space. And it's still that same objective that I refer to as my selfish want of wanting to be happier at work, wanting to have a better place to work. So the way that we approach that is we got a small group that we called our Lean Steering Committee together to really get educated in lean principles and start applying them in the manufacturing spaces. And that grew and gained momentum to the point that we now have a continuous improvement leader who I think is on the call with us to really be the lighthouse guiding our continuous improvement endeavors and really facilitating that further empowerment of our employees, our teammates, to be able to find ways to make day-to-day activity better, to get better a little bit at a time. And that's really the way we try to characterize it. It's great to hit those home runs. Everybody wants to see that home run hit. It's like this one change that had this huge cascading benefit that's going to, give us all of this great value. But it's about those little base hits every once in a while. Sometimes you're going to strike out, but you learn from it. And that's really the way we try to package continuous improvement. In the Scrum space, the way it manifests once again for us is through that retrospective. When we have our sprint retrospectives, we're going into that looking at, okay, what did we try? What was our action item from the last retrospective? Did we accomplish that action item? Okay, let's talk about the sprint that we just completed, how we worked together as a team, how things went. What can we do better? And out of that, we craft an action item that becomes our immediate focus for that next iteration. And we keep that action item on our board, in our virtual spaces, to make sure everybody has visibility and can see that, so everybody knows how important that is for our success. So we drive that continuous improvement, one action item, one sprint at a time.
Yeah, I think you said the magic word, that you keep it on your board. That's exactly what I'm trying to do, is put it on have a separate backlog of all the continuous improvement. Okay, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah,
I got confirmation.
Yes, one thing, Sanjay, though, I would say don't separate it from the work, where the regular work that's being done.
Okay.
Keep it in the same space. Keep it visible in the same space.
Yeah, it is visible. Yeah. Got it. Okay. Thank you.
For us, when we were still in the building and we were all co-located, we have a visual board that we would use to track our Scrum activities. And there's a section on our board for our, retrospective action items. So every time we would have our huddle at the board, we would be able to see that activity. Now that we're, relegated to using Teams, in our Teams meeting space, we have those activities readily visible within there. And it's part of our daily Scrum process to talk about, all right, don't forget our action items for this sprint. It's just kind of gotten into our process. It's taken a while for us to make that habit, but we were able to fall into it.
Okay. Sorry, I'll make it extremely brief. So on the team, when you're meeting, so the Scrum Master is presenting the board, is it?
Mm-hmm. We can. Typically what ends up happening is that after the retrospective, we have those action items. And then as we go into the next sprint for the action item, every day we have our daily Scrum. At the end of the meeting, the Scrum Master reminds everyone, he or she doesn't necessarily pull it up for everybody to see, but they at least make mention of, hey, remember our sprint action items for this sprint are, this, that, and the other. So those, there's a audible reminder every day in our daily Scrum huddle for that.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome, Sanjay.
All right, folks, we're gonna close out. Quick reminders. Our next event is July 9th. That's a lunchtime event with Nicole Spence-Boone. We're talking about 3 factors you need to know to succeed with scaling Agile. And then on the 14th, we have a special event with the New York City Lean Kanban user group that's hosted by Ihab, who's with us here on the call, and he's going to be running the beer game, which is a game in system dynamics. So hopefully you can join us for those events. Franky, thanks a lot for sharing with us your experience, and
thank you for having me.
Continuing on your Agile journey.